is a new collection of mine. Just me and all my cars when I was a little kid, spending all my money on cars.
Oh, that's one of your what? What is that, a Ferrari or something?
I don't know, it's a Lamborghini.
Lamborghini.
Yeah.
Most people only remember Mike Tyson as the unstoppable force who tore through the boxing world, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, a man who looked too powerful to ever break. But the truth he carries at 59 is far darker than the legend. Behind the knockouts, behind the fame, behind the chaos, was a lifetime of wounds he hid from the world, losses that shattered him, addictions that consumed him, and moments so painful he nearly didn't survive them. And now, after decades of silence, Tyson is finally revealing the heartbreak he never let the cameras see. What was the tragedy that haunted him through every victory? And why is he choosing to expose it now? Join us as we uncover the devastating truth Mike Tyson has kept buried for years. The pain behind the power. Before the world ever crowned Mike Tyson, the most terrifying heavyweight in boxing history, he was just a broken kid wandering the streets of Brownsville, New York, hungry, scared, and forgotten. People speak of Tyson's knockout power as if it came from some superhuman place, but the truth is far darker. That power was born from fear, from trauma, from a childhood where survival wasn't a lesson. It was the only rule. Tyson was robbed, beaten, mocked, and left on his own before he understood what family even meant. He fought not to win, but because no one else would fight for him. And then came the one person who saw something more. Cus D'Amato. Cus didn't just teach Tyson how to throw a punch. He taught him how to believe in something again. He became the father figure Tyson had prayed for without ever saying the words. Under Cus, the outcast became a prodigy. The angry boy became a disciplined fighter. The forgotten kid became a rising star. But fate can be cruel, especially to those who have already suffered enough. When Tyson finally began to feel safe, when he finally belonged somewhere, he was forced to live through the one loss he could not survive emotionally: Cus's death. It wasn't just his mentor that died, it was his stability, his identity, and the last bit of innocence he had left. After that moment, everything began to crack beneath him, even if the world couldn't see it yet. But how did this devastating loss set off a chain of events that would eventually destroy everything Tyson had built? When Tyson stepped into the ring at just 20 years old and destroyed Trevor Berbick to become the youngest heavyweight champion of all time, fans thought they were witnessing greatness in its purest form. He looked invincible, an unstoppable machine created for one purpose: domination. Reporters called him a phenomenon. Promoters called him a gold mine. Fans called him a legend in the making. But behind every roar of the crowd was a pain that fame couldn't fix. Without Cus, Tyson was alone at the exact moment he needed guidance the most. His circle changed overnight. People he barely knew were suddenly handling his money, making decisions for him, pulling him in every direction while pretending to protect him. Tyson didn't see it then, but he was being swallowed by a world built on greed, manipulation, and exploitation. And as he kept knocking men out in the ring, he was being knocked down in his personal life by betrayal, loneliness, and emotional instability. He had money, fame, power, everything he thought he ever wanted. But when the lights went off, he was still the same scared kid from Brownsville, trying desperately to fill a void that no title belt could ever heal. The world saw a champion. Tyson felt like a prisoner. But what was the moment when the cracks in his life finally burst into public view, exposing a truth that shocked even his biggest fans? The marriage, the meltdown, and the moment the world turned against him. By the late 1980s, Mike Tyson was more than a champion. He was a cultural force. Hollywood adored him, corporations fought to sponsor him, and audiences worldwide couldn't get enough of him. But the higher he climbed, the more unstable the ground beneath him became. When he married actress Robin Givens in 1988, the press celebrated it as a new golden chapter in Tyson's life. To outsiders, it looked like the fairy tale ending the troubled kid from Brownsville deserved. But behind closed doors, it was anything but magical. Their relationship was filled with arguments, distrust, and emotional turbulence. Tyson was struggling with fame, trauma, sleepless nights, and the internal rage he'd carried since childhood. Givens, meanwhile, felt overwhelmed, frightened, and cornered. The marriage became a pressure cooker, one that would soon explode on national television. In a now infamous interview with Barbara Walters, Givens sat beside Tyson and described their marriage as torture, all while Tyson stared silently, trapped between confusion, embarrassment, and heartbreak. Viewers had never seen him so exposed, so powerless, so visibly devastated. Overnight, public sympathy shifted. He was no longer perceived as the invincible warrior. For the first time, he was the subject of deep suspicion and relentless criticism. That interview didn't just damage his reputation, it shattered his emotional world. Tyson, still grieving Cuss, still searching for stability, now faced a humiliation so global that it permanently changed how he saw himself. He spiraled further, falling into reckless behavior, bad influences, and terrible decisions. His personal life was unraveling faster than he could throw a punch. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would transform Tyson from a troubled champion into the center of one of the most controversial scandals in sports history. The conviction that destroyed his legacy. In 1992, Mike Tyson faced the darkest chapter of his life, the one that still follows him to this day. He was convicted of rape and sentenced to 6 years in prison. For millions of fans, the news was not just shocking, it was impossible to process. How could the greatest fighter on earth fall so far, so fast? But for Tyson himself, the collapse felt almost predestined. He had been spiraling for years, surrounded by people who used him, pushed him, and fed the worst parts of his impulses. Tyson maintained his innocence, yet the jury saw it differently. When the verdict was read, the courtroom felt heavy, the world stunned. The once untouchable champion was now an inmate, and for the first time since childhood, the cameras stopped loving him. The media tore him apart, critics called him a monster, and sponsors abandoned him instantly. Inside prison, Tyson had nothing left but time, and the ghosts he'd spent his whole life trying to escape. He trained obsessively, read constantly, and reflected on the choices that had led him there. His body remained powerful, but his identity was cracking. Every night inside that cell forced him to confront the truth. Wealth couldn't save him, fame couldn't protect him, and no amount of knockout victories could erase the self-destruction he'd carried since boyhood. And yet, even as he sank into the lowest moment of his life, a spark remained. Tyson still had his strength, his will, his pain, and an inner fire that refused to die. When he walked out of prison in 1995, fans wondered if the legend would rise again, or if the world had already witnessed the last of Iron Mike. But freedom didn't bring peace, because the Tyson the world saw next was not the Tyson they remembered. He was angrier, more unpredictable, and headed straight toward one of the most shocking moments in sports history. The bite heard around the world. When Mike Tyson stepped into the ring with Evander Holyfield for their second fight in 1997, the world was watching for a comeback. Fans wanted redemption, Tyson wanted revenge, and the boxing world hoped to see Iron Mike reclaim the throne that once belonged solely to him. But instead, that night became one of the most shocking moments in sports history. The moment that would come to define Tyson for decades. From the opening bell, Holyfield dominated. Tyson, frustrated and overwhelmed, felt himself slipping into that familiar darkness, the same boiling rage that Cuss had once struggled to keep under control. Each clinch, each shove, each unanswered punch pushed Tyson deeper into emotional chaos. He wasn't just fighting an opponent, he was fighting every betrayal, every humiliation, every trauma he'd never truly healed from. And then it happened. In a split second of desperation and fury, Tyson leaned in and bit Holyfield's ear. The pain, the blood, the disbelief, it all erupted at once. Holyfield screamed. The crowd exploded. Commentators were stunned. The referees struggled to restore order, but Tyson, pacing like a trapped animal, was beyond reasoning. When he bit Holyfield again, it became clear. Mike wasn't losing a fight. He was losing himself. The boxing world recoiled. Overnight, Tyson became a global villain. He was fined $3 million, suspended from boxing, and condemned by fans who once worshipped him. Sponsors vanished. Newspapers ran front-page headlines calling him unstable, dangerous, a disgrace. But beneath the outrage was something far more tragic. A man drowning in his own unprocessed trauma, exploding publicly in the only language he had ever learned: violence. And yet, as Tyson sat alone afterward, staring at the wreckage of his career, he didn't deny what he'd done. He didn't make excuses. He didn't hide. He simply asked himself one question: how did I become this? But the bite, as shocking as it was, wasn't the end of Tyson's downfall. Because the years ahead held something even darker: bankruptcy, betrayals, addiction, and the kind of grief no parent should ever endure. By the early 2000s, Tyson's life had become a slow-motion collapse. The man who had once earned more than $300 million was now broke. His fortune had evaporated through reckless spending, lawsuits, dishonest advisors, and misguided generosity. He bought mansions he never lived in, cars he didn't drive, parties he didn't remember, and entourages that grew larger as his bank account grew smaller. Tyson wasn't just financially bankrupt, he was spiritually empty. He turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain, but substances only made the darkness heavier. He found himself waking up in unfamiliar places, surrounded by people he barely knew, drowning in guilt and exhaustion. He spoke later about feeling like he was waiting to die, trapped in a cycle he could no longer escape. Then, in 2009, tragedy struck in the cruelest possible way. Tyson's 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, died in a freak accident at home. The loss shattered him. The man who believed he had endured every kind of suffering, poverty, abuse, humiliation, incarceration, was suddenly facing a pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. For days, he didn't speak. For weeks, he barely moved. The fighter who once terrified heavyweights struggled to breathe through his grief. Tyson later said that losing Exodus forced him to confront everything he had been running from his entire life. It pushed him to the brink, but strangely, it also became the turning point. Because inside that unbearable sorrow, Tyson realized he had one final fight left. Not for a championship, not for glory, not for money, but for his sanity, his family, and whatever remained of his future. He began therapy. He entered recovery. He cut out toxic people. He learned to talk about his trauma instead of burying it. Slowly, painfully, Tyson started rebuilding himself. Not as Iron Mike, not as the villain the world remembered, but as a man trying desperately to heal. But as he rebuilt his life, one haunting question followed him everywhere. Would the world ever let him move on from the monster they believed he was? Or was redemption impossible for someone like Mike Tyson? After years of chaos, bankruptcy, addiction, and heartbreak, Mike Tyson stood at a crossroads, one that would determine whether he became a tragic cautionary tale or something far more unexpected, a symbol of redemption. But the road back wasn't glamorous. It wasn't public. It didn't happen in a ring or under bright lights. It happened in quiet, painful moments that nobody saw. Tyson began rebuilding his life brick by brick. He attended meetings. He apologized to people he had hurt. He confronted the demons he had spent decades outrunning. And slowly, he rediscovered pieces of himself he thought had died long ago. Humor, vulnerability, even gentleness. The world couldn't believe it. Iron Mike, showing tenderness, crying openly during interviews, speaking about trauma, loss, and emotional healing. Yes, because this time, the transformation wasn't an act. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was survival. Tyson began doing one thing he had never done before: telling the truth. He spoke honestly about the pain of his childhood, about his mother's neglect, about being bullied, about turning to violence as a shield. He revealed that fear, not anger, had always driven him, and he admitted that he spent most of his life not understanding who he was or why he kept destroying the things he loved most. People listened, and surprisingly, they empathized. Tyson's one-man show, Undisputed Truth, allowed audiences to see the man behind the myth, a man who was flawed, wounded, messy, hilarious, heartbreaking, fragile, grateful, and human. For the first time in decades, Mike Tyson wasn't a villain. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a headline. He was a survivor. But even as he slowly rebuilt his reputation, a new fear began to creep in. A fear Tyson had never admitted publicly until recently. What happens when your body begins to fail, but the world still wants you to be a warrior? That question would lead him into the most controversial decision of his later life, and one that would leave fans terrified. In 2020, the world watched in disbelief as Mike Tyson, now in his mid-50s, announced he was returning to the ring. Videos surfaced of him training like a man possessed. Lightning-fast punches, brutal combinations, footwork so sharp it looked impossible for someone his age. "I'm back," he growled at the end of one clip. And the world believed him. But behind the viral videos and the roaring hype, those closest to Tyson were terrified. His body wasn't the same. His joints cracked, his back stiffened, his hands numbed from years of damage. He carried injuries he never fully healed from. Old trauma lived inside his muscles like ghosts waiting to resurface. Doctors warned him, friends begged him. Even longtime fans felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. Because the truth was simple. Mike Tyson returning to the ring wasn't just a comeback, it was a gamble with his life. Tyson admitted later that the comeback wasn't really about boxing, it was about identity. When he trained, he felt alive again. He felt purpose. For a brief moment, he could silence the doubts, silence the pain, silence the decades of guilt and trauma that still whispered in the background. Fighting was the only place he ever felt in control. But stepping back into the ring raised a question that no one could ignore. Was Mike Tyson fighting opponents or fighting time itself? And more importantly, how long could a man carry the weight of being both a legend and a tragedy before something finally broke? As Tyson pushed himself deeper into training camps, private sparring sessions, and media appearances, a quiet truth began revealing itself. One far more painful than any punch he ever took in the ring. Being Mike Tyson, even at 59, was still a full-time burden. Every room he walked into carried whispers. Every headline used his name for shock value. Every comment online dissected his mistakes, his tragedies, or his past violence. No matter how much he evolved, the world still saw him through a lens built decades earlier, and that weighed on him. Behind the scenes, Tyson admitted that he feared becoming irrelevant more than anything else. The spotlight even though it burned him, had also kept him warm. It had given structure to a life that otherwise drifted between extremes. And when he wasn't fighting, performing, or entertaining, the silence felt suffocating, almost dangerous. He confessed in interviews that he still woke up some mornings unsure of who he was supposed to be. A monster? A legend? A father? A survivor? A cautionary tale? The public demanded all of these versions at once, and he never quite knew which one to give them. But it wasn't just emotional turmoil. Tyson's physical health had begun unraveling in ways he could no longer ignore. Old injuries flared at night, keeping him awake. His back stiffened until he needed assistance to stand upright on certain mornings. His legs, once explosive and unstoppable, now trembled after short bursts of intensity. His hands, battered from decades of destruction, tingled with nerve pain. And yet, he kept training. He kept pushing. He kept preparing for wars that his body was no longer prepared to fight. People close to him worried he was entering a dangerous cycle, chasing youth, chasing relevance, chasing the only world where he ever felt in control. Because when the gloves came off, he often felt powerless. But the darkest part was something Tyson rarely admitted publicly. He didn't fear his opponents. He feared himself. The version of Mike Tyson he used to be. The one who could appear without warning, triggered by pressure, fear, or emotional overload. As the comeback hype grew, Tyson found himself asking a terrifying question. What happens if he steps into the ring again and discovers that the greatest opponent he must face is the man he once was? The world would soon find out, but not before another devastating challenge blindsided him. One that had nothing to do with boxing, and everything to do with the fragility of a life rebuilt on scar tissue. Just as Tyson seemed to regain momentum in his life, with business ventures thriving, a renewed public image, and fans cheering for his comeback, a heartbreaking tragedy struck him at the core of his humanity. In the midst of preparing for another high-profile event, Tyson received news no parent should ever have to hear. It was sudden, it was horrific, and it shattered him in ways even he struggled to articulate. His 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, had been involved in a devastating household accident, the kind that unfolds in seconds but changes a family forever. Tyson rushed to the hospital, frantic, desperate, praying harder than he ever had before. But despite the efforts of doctors and medical staff, Exodus did not survive. In that moment, the undefeated fighter who had walked through fire his entire life finally broke. He collapsed emotionally, unable to speak, unable to comprehend how someone so innocent, so full of light, could be taken so brutally. Tyson later said that this loss was the only time in his life he felt true, complete hopelessness. A pain deeper than any punch, any humiliation, any scandal. He blamed himself. He questioned the universe. He spiraled toward a darkness that nearly swallowed him whole. Friends feared he would lose himself entirely. They watched as grief wrapped tightly around him, draining the strength of a man who once seemed superhuman. Tyson withdrew from the world, retreating into silence, wrestling with emotions he had been taught never to feel, let alone express. But grief doesn't leave quietly. It lingers, festering like an open wound. And Tyson soon realized that no level of physical toughness could protect him from emotional devastation. He could only survive it, or let it consume him. Slowly, painfully, he began speaking about Exodus. He shared memories, stories, fragments of her laughter. He allowed himself to weep in front of cameras, in front of friends, in front of strangers. Iron Mike, the man who once terrified the world, became a symbol of vulnerability, a father grieving openly and courageously. And yet, even as he emerged from the darkest season of his life, one final question loomed. How much more trauma can one man endure before even a warrior like Mike Tyson reaches his breaking point? In the years following the loss of his daughter, Tyson tried to rebuild his identity piece by piece. But healing is never linear. And for him, it was a battlefield all its own. Every step toward progress felt like dragging emotional chains through wet cement. He meditated, trained, prayed, and even isolated himself for months at a time. But no matter how far he ran, the world refused to let him escape the mythology it built around him. Every interview seemed to circle back to his past. Every headline used the same vocabulary: troubled, violent, controversial. Even when he spoke of peace, interviewers prodded him about rage. When he talked about love, they rewound him back to chaos. Tyson realized that for many people, he wasn't a man. He was a spectacle. So he did something few expected. He surrendered to transparency. If the world insisted on seeing every scar, he would show them openly. He spoke about trauma, poverty, shame, addiction, loneliness, and guilt, subjects he once buried beneath bravado and aggression. He even admitted that his greatest challenge wasn't an opponent in the ring, but the young, damaged version of himself he still carried inside. But vulnerability came with a cost. Some fans celebrated his honesty. Others mocked it. A few accused him of using trauma as a storyline. Tyson felt the sting of that criticism deeply. After all, the person he was trying hardest to convince wasn't his audience, it was himself. Still, he kept going. He launched new ventures. He practiced forgiveness. He tried to live kindly, even when kindness felt unnatural. And slowly, he found a kind of peace, a fragile version of it, but peace nonetheless. Yet even then, a shadow hung overhead. Tyson understood that no matter how much he evolved, there would always be people waiting for him to fail. People who believed a man with his past didn't deserve redemption. It left him wondering, can a man truly escape the version of himself the world refuses to let die? Just when Tyson began to reclaim his footing, a new and unexpected threat emerged, one that had nothing to do with the ring, the media, or the ghosts of his past. It came from within his own body. Years of brutal training, concussive blows, and physical punishment had begun to surface with troubling intensity. Tyson started experiencing unexplained pain, sudden weakness in his legs, and moments where he felt disconnected from his own movement. Doctors warned him that pushing his body too far could lead to permanent damage, perhaps even leaving him unable to walk without assistance later in life. For someone who had built his entire identity around physical dominance, the idea was devastating. The man once feared for superhuman strength now found himself struggling with tasks he once did effortlessly. Simple stretches became battles. Jogging became a chore. Heavy bags felt heavier than ever. Some mornings he felt decades older than he actually was. And yet, he kept going, not out of ego, but out of necessity. Because for Tyson, movement wasn't just physical, it was emotional survival. Training was the one place where the noise in his mind finally quieted. The gym was his sanctuary, and he refused to let his own body take that from him. But even as he continued fighting through the pain, something deeper troubled him. The realization that his legacy was no longer under his control. He watched interviews, documentaries, and articles written about him, some kind, some cruel, some exploitative. He wondered how he would be remembered when he was no longer here to defend himself. As he approached 60, Tyson began speaking more openly about mortality. He admitted that sometimes he felt closer to the end than people realized. He acknowledged that life had humbled him in ways even he didn't fully expect. And through it all, he asked himself the same haunting question. When Mike Tyson is gone, who will people remember? The monster he once was, or the man he fought to become? In the end, Mike Tyson's story isn't about boxing. It isn't about fame or belts or knockouts. It's about a man who spent his entire life outrunning shadows that were cast long before he ever stepped into a ring. A man who rose higher than anyone expected, fell harder than anyone imagined, and somehow, against every odd, found the strength to stand back up. At 59, Tyson carries scars that no camera has ever captured, losses that shaped him, regrets that haunt him, lessons that came at a cost no champion should ever have to pay. And yet, when you look at him now, you don't just see the fighter he was. You see the survivor he became. His journey reminds us that greatness doesn't protect anyone from heartbreak, and that even the strongest people you know may be fighting a battle you'll never see. So as the world continues judging him by the headlines, the controversies, the chaos, Tyson hopes people look just a little deeper, not at the myth, not at the monster, but at the man who has spent decades trying to rebuild what life tore apart. And maybe that's the real victory. Not the titles, not the fame, but the simple act of choosing to keep living, even when life tried to break him. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you see Mike Tyson in a different light, feel free to subscribe and join us again as we uncover the untold truths the world tries to forget.